So if you don't already know me, I'm Tina Caputo. I'm the editor for Vineyard and Winery Management magazine. And before I introduce the panelists, I just want to say a few words about the importance of wine bloggers to the wine industry. And I really believe that the explosion of wine bloggers in the last few years has been one of the very best things to happen in the wine industry in recent years. In the past, as many of you know, there were basically only a few voices out there that were influencing the masses in terms of wine coverage. And now we literally have dozens and dozens of people from all different perspectives that are out there writing about wine, and that's a really incredible thing to have happen. And I also wanted to thank the panelists for coming down for this. These really are A-listers, not just in the world of wine blogging, but in the world of wine writing. So this is really great. So before I launch into this, I'm just going to do some little intros of all the panelists. And I just wanted to point out that I think a lot of people, when they think about bloggers, they think maybe of people who are just amateurs that are, writing off the cuff and don't really know all that much about their given subject. But that is not the case with any of these guys here today. These are true professionals, so I wanted to give you a little bit of information about their backgrounds and their credentials before we get on to questions. So, to my right, we have Mr. Frederick Keppel. His blog is called Bigger Than Your Head. He's based in Memphis, Tennessee. Before he became a journalist, he taught English at various colleges and universities for 17 years. He wrote for the Commercial Appeal newspaper in Memphis for 22 years. And at the paper, he was the book review editor, restaurant reviewer, visual arts reporter, and arts critic. And he also wrote a wine column for 20 years. Next, we have Joe Roberts, also known as 1WineDude. So Joe is a consultant and also a musician in the Philadelphia area. In addition to his blog, he also writes a wine column for Playboy.com, which I'm sure you all frequent for the articles. And he's also the wine expert for Answers.com. He holds an intermediate and advanced certificates from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and he's a certified specialist of wine through the Society of Wine Educators. He was included on IntoWine.com's list of the 100 most influential people in the U.S. wine industry for 2013. And in 2010, he won the Wine Blog Awards honor for Best Wine Blog, and he was a finalist in the category in 2011, 2012, and 2013. Finally, we have David White of Terroirist. He's based in Washington, D.C. He's the founder and editor of the daily wine blog Terroirist.com. He's also the author of the nationally syndicated wine column hosted by Great Collective. His wine writings also appeared in dozens of other publications, including The World of Fine Wine, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. He holds an advanced certificate from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and he was named in 2012 as one of America's 9 most important wine bloggers. And at the 2013 Blog Awards, his site was named Best Overall Wine Blog. So just to start things off, I wanted to have each of the panelists tell you a little bit about their blogs, what they cover and don't cover, and who their intended audiences are. Frederick?
Hi. My blog, biggerthanyourhead.net, concentrates on wine reviews in all sorts of different categories of wine, price ranges and genres and geography. I do some wine commentary, not so much on the wine industry as on sort of philosophical and meditative ideas about wine. The audience, I think, is a general audience of consumers who are interested in trying different kinds of wine and in the background behind wine. So that when I review wines, I tend to include information about how the wine is made, the geographical elements, the historic elements, the personalities behind the wine if possible, because I think that gives a context for drinking wine that helps to make the experience more all-encompassing.
Hello. With 1WineDude.com, because I have other outlets around wine writing that are much more traditional, 1WineDude is getting weirder and weirder. So, because I'm weird, yeah, it's true. And so, both are true. And what, I'm really after the intermediate consumer in wine, so someone who isn't really after the 101, and this is what these grapes taste like, or this is an introduction to X. I'm after someone who's kind of between that and the encyclopedias, essentially going off the deep end and getting certifications. What's great about it is in the discussions and in the readership, I get an interesting cross-section, I think, because of that. So I get those intermediate consumers, but I also get wine PR and winemakers and marketers and things like that. So it's just, you get these really interesting discussions when they do happen because of that cross-section. I've been focusing more and more, because my other outlets usually require me to write about higher distribution wines and more general concepts. For 1WineDude, it's becoming more and more personal. And I'm shying away from those things and much more onto lower production, interesting stories, places that people aren't talking about, weird stuff, and primarily stuff that gets the hairs in the back of my neck standing up and gets me all excited and trying to share that with the readers.
Thank you, Joe. I have a very good sense of what my audience is thanks to this tool called Google Analytics, and I've also done some demographic surveys of my readers. About half of my wine readers are in the industry, which is not surprising because if you work in an industry, you probably do spend a lot of your time reading about that industry. And I'd say the other half of my readers are wine geeks and aspirational wine geeks. And I say that, like Joe, I do have other outlets where I write for a more general interest consumer. But I'm convinced that if you're visiting a wine blog, especially if you're visiting my wine blog, you spend a lot of your day thinking about wine, whereas a lot of people procrastinate at the office by going to ESPN.com or Deadspin, or maybe going to a Bruce Springsteen message board. I think a lot of people spend their days at work, and when they procrastinate, they visit wine message boards and wine blogs. That's my audience. It's the wine geeks who are interested in spending their days consuming as much information as they possibly can about wine. So what are they looking for? To Joe's point, they're looking for good stories, they're looking for good angles, they're looking for the weird, the unique, the interesting, the unusual. They also want to live vicariously through others. Right now in San Francisco, there's an event called La Poulet, which is where every Burgundy collector in the world flies in and alternates between San Francisco and New York. Last year, a good friend of mine went to La Poulet in New York, so I actually asked him to write a guide to La Poulet, and it's become one of our most successful posts ever. Because I think a lot of people who are very interested in wine, even if they can't attend an event like that, they want to read about what it's like to attend an event like that. So I guess that's the background of my site.
I think what Joe said was really interesting about, sort of being a little bit weird and liking to focus on those sort of weird offbeat things. And I think that's one of the really great things about wine blogs is that you're not bound in the way that traditional media can be as far as what you can cover. Having to have a certain case production, a certain level of availability, having to cover, mainstream wines from mainstream wine regions. I think that's really an opportunity for wineries in other parts of the country, so that's great. So I wanted to ask each of you what sort of information you would like to be receiving from wineries, maybe compared to what you actually do receive on a regular basis.
I think most wine bloggers, especially in terms of general reviewing, are largely dependent on samples, review samples from wineries, producers, importers, even local wholesalers. And in anticipation of those, of course, we like to receive information. Basically, what I want is that kind of basic information in in the form of, an email press release that cuts to the heart of what a wine or a producer is, or what the producer is trying to do. I don't want, emotion and passion and lyricism and poetry. I just want the basic information. In terms of the wine that gets the most priority from me, that is to say the wine that I will put at the front of my reviewing list, and those are the wines that come from people who contact me and say, is it okay for us to send you these wines? And here's what we're about. And that's the kind of thing that I would give priority to. The wines that I don't give priority to are those that just arrive in floods, in boxes, and there they are, and there's no information, and no one has contacted me. I mean, there's, even in the world of the internet, it's nice to have a personal touch, so that you have a sense of getting to know a winemaker or a producer, whether it's through their marketing people or their marketing person or a PR firm or whatever. It's nice to have a bit of a personal touch.
Just building on what you just said, the personal touch actually for me is key. What I want your wine. That's the first. I want your wine, okay? Because everything starts with the wine. If the wine sucks, I don't want to talk about it. If the wine is really good, then we can open a discussion at that point. I'd love to have all the vitals and some background, but really I want contact information. Because if I love that wine, then I'm probably going to want to talk to you about that wine and see if there's an interesting story to tell. Hey, there are some great wines where there's no story. I mean, they're consistent, it's just a great wine, and the people are boring. And I've had those situations, I've visited places, I'm not going to name them since we're recording, but I visited some of those places and thought, this sucks because, man, I love this wine, and this is such a boring visit. Like, there's just no story here. So you need a little bit more than just the juice, but it's got to start with the juice. It's amazing how many requests I get, or just anything where people reaching out to contact me and they tell me everything, but don't offer the wine. It's not clear in the communication whether or not they're going to get a sample to me, which living in Pennsylvania admittedly is hard for a lot of people, but still, the first thing that anyone's going to ask on a geeky site, right, is how was the wine? So if it doesn't start with that, we literally have nowhere to go from that point.
To add to this, I'd say I'm going to take a different angle. I'll talk about the pitches that upset me. The ones that upset me are the ones where the PR person or winery owner or producer or importer clearly hasn't given any thought as to who it is they're sending the email to. Of course, the obvious example is the press release without context that's pasted into the body of an email. I promise you that 99.9% of all wine journalists simply click delete without even skimming it. A personalized note on top matters quite a bit. You could say, Dear David, check out the press release below, and that makes me more likely to read it. But further, keep in mind that there are different types of wine writers. There are lifestyle journalists. They might be interested in a new resort and spa that opened near a winery in Virginia or near a winery in New York or Paso Robles. I'm not a lifestyle journalist. I'm not writing about massage treatments at bed and breakfasts that happen to be near wineries. I mean, I'm happy to go check them out. But I'm certainly, my audience doesn't particularly care about that. Similarly, knowing my audience and my skill set as a wine writer, I'm not writing recipes, for example. I'm not writing about really mass-produced wine, at least not on my website. So on that note, if you're looking for a story, a bottle of wine doesn't make a story most of the time. A meal doesn't make a story. That's the other thing you'll see a lot. Hey, I'm going to be in town. I'd love to take you out to lunch. If it's the winemaker, sure, that could result in an interesting story. But I'm not going to get any value from having lunch with a PR person. So I guess, does that answer the question? was very negative, sorry about that.
It's very annoying to get email, publicity releases and things from people who obviously have never read the blog. You see, and they'll say, I know your readers would love to have a link to our, infographic on this, spa that just opened or something like that. No, my readers wouldn't, because that's not what I write about.
We could do this all day. And we do this all the time on Facebook. We talk about all the failed, terrible PR pitches that we received, but I have a feeling that in sort of regions east and in the Midwest, I think maybe there isn't much outreach at all to bloggers and other wine writers, maybe because people think that, well, the wines aren't available, or they're not interested, or that sort of thing. So maybe you guys could tell them, what sort of communications you do receive from wineries in the East, if at all.
In terms of American wine, the vast majority of what I write about is California, followed by Oregon, a little Washington. Actually, in my 30 years of writing about wine, I've been blogging since 2006, I have received communications or samples from one winery in Virginia and one in New Jersey. And that was in the past 2 years. I realize that most of the production on the East Coast is sold within a few miles of the winery, probably. In the tasting room, in the cellar, or perhaps at local restaurants. And because of that, I think that there may be a view that we don't need national publicity. We don't need wine bloggers. We don't need that sort of outreach. But I think that's a parochial view. And I think that wineries, particularly from what I understand, not from my personal experience, but in Virginia, North Carolina, Long Island, the Finger Lakes, increasingly actually in New Jersey, do need to get the word out, do need to get their histories, their personal stories, and their wines so that we can write about them and help to create that sort of interest in that market so that people who are traveling to Virginia and North Carolina and New Jersey and New York can say, well, I read about these wineries on Bigger Than Your Head or One Wine Dude, and so this gives me, a sort of a guide to where I might want to go and taste some of these wines that I've read about.
Interestingly, in the sessions in this room right before we took the stage, Nielsen presented data, and one of the slides talked about how the local concept of local, was actually very strong, particularly with buyers of craft beer and wine. And those people are spending money. They're spending like $20 and up, largely. That's where a lot of the growth is coming from. I mean, that is right at the heart of what I think a lot of Midwestern and Eastern wineries are doing. I mean, you can't produce wine inexpensively. You fall into some of those price points naturally, and you want that. You want to cultivate that sense of local. To Frederick's point, though, if you don't have that kind of visibility, then a little bit more nationally, what you're going to find is, I mean, if you expect the situation to never ever change, right, ever, in terms of, we're always going to sell out, we're always going to sell mostly from the tasting room, etc. You expect that to never change ever, and the U.S. to never open up, further open up direct to consumer, and other trends that obviously we're seeing that are starting to grow slowly, to never change the laws, which obviously we're seeing challenges to that very publicly in several states. If you never have that, then fine, don't look for national press. But the stories, in a way, are really tailor-made for blogs and that type of coverage. Because as bloggers, we're always looking for those types of unique situations, those struggles, especially if the product is good. Those stories, they really appeal to us. So if you're looking for national coverage, we're the best spot to go to in terms of potentially getting the story told, I think. So there you go.
First, I'll just address quickly how often do I get outreach from Eastern and Midwest wineries. Very, very rarely. I receive the Governor's Cup case from Virginia every year when they put that together. And I've received wine samples from a handful of places in the Finger Lakes. But that's about it. I have a lot of exposure to the Virginia wine industry because I live in DC. I've spent time in Maryland at last year's Drink Local Wine Conference. I spent time in Colorado at the Drink Local Wine Conference 2 years ago. And I've had a lot of New York wines simply because I think New York has a really good story to tell and makes better wines than people realize. To that point though, that story needs to be told. If you have ambitions beyond, it might not be suitable for people in this room, but if the ambitions of, say, a Virginia winery extend beyond wedding traffic, bachelorette party traffic, and sweet wine traffic, then you have to reach out to a national audience and make your pitch to them. And it's not a terribly complicated pitch to make. A couple of years ago at the Wine America conference in DC, the Colorado Wine Board reached out to me and said, hey, we know you live in DC, and I met some of these guys before. How about we put together an event where we get in touch with some folks from Virginia. We're going to bring a bunch of wines from Colorado. You and all your friends bring wines from California or France, and let's brown bag everything and hang out and see what comes out on top. That's not really a PR pitch that you would expect to hear, but it was a really fun night, and a lot of wines were opened up. And I love doing that. I can't tell you how often I bring Virginia Chardonnay to events and wrap it up in a brown bag and force my friends to guess what it is. I've done that with Syrah from Maryland as well. I've done that with Pinot Noir and Riesling from New York, Riesling from Michigan. So there's a good story there to be told, and from what I can tell, aside from a handful of journalists like Dave McIntyre at the Washington Post, there aren't a lot of wine writers telling that story. And I don't necessarily think it's their fault because everyone is busy. So we need help developing angles and coming up with good story ideas. So, and unfortunately, there isn't much outreach from wineries outside of the very sophisticated industry that exists in California, Oregon, and Washington.
But a very quick add to that. The samples I get from what we call those sort of emerging regions, for lack of a better term, I know some have been around for a very long time, it's a rounding error compared to California, a rounding error. That's the bad news, but the good news is because we're always looking for unique angles, when I get those samples, they're going to stand out. So it's not like, you shouldn't think of it in terms of shooting a pea at an enormous wall. Actually, it's going to, the fact that I even got it is going to jump out.
That's exactly right. I get wine samples because I do occasional reviews for consumer publications, and everything I get is from California, a little bit from Washington, and there's one winery in Virginia who sends me samples, and I get so excited when I get those samples. It's like, yay, something different. It's not another California Chardonnay, and I bump that way up on the list of the things I'm going to taste because it's something different and something fun. So, yes.
Do we need to talk about the legislation, because we've got a lot of things going on in every state that is either detrimental to the wineries, and then sometimes they even are helping it. But do you talk about that in your blogs?
I mean, I'll jump in first. One of my many hats, sorry, I'll grab the mic. The answer for me is yes. One of the many hats I wear is president of the American Wine Consumer Coalition. So I care a lot about consumer access to wine. So I'm writing quite regularly about whether it's supermarket wine access, corkage being legal, direct-to-consumer shipping being legal. I think my audience cares a lot about those battles. Maybe I'm writing for myself, but I assume they care a lot about those battles. So yeah, I think that's an issue. I think every wine writer I've argued before that every wine writer should make it their business to care about wine laws and regulation, because at the end of the day, the consumer needs to access that wine in order to enjoy what we want to write about. Just in today's Washington Post, Dave McIntyre has an article about these two really cool, unique wine clubs that not many people know about. And it's quite sad that as a parenthetical to a middle paragraph in the story, he says, unfortunately, if you live in Maryland, you can't join either of these wine clubs. So that is, that is a story that's getting out there, and I think a lot of wine journalists are certainly willing to help in these fights that wineries are engaged in.
To add to that, I live in Pennsylvania, so I have it really hard with that. And yeah, I have covered that. I couch it as, I would say, it's serious op-ed concepts couched in an angry Pennsylvania wine buyer voice. And so I try to make it weird and fun and entertaining and comparing them to communism and things like that. But in the process of that, people hopefully walk away in that op-ed realizing the biggest, or the most frequent, I should say, comment I get when I do those sort of op-ed pieces is, oh man, I'm so glad I don't live there. Which, hopefully tells people something or gets them stirred up to actually take some kind of action with their legislators.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about social media and opportunities in that arena. I know all three of you are very active in the social media space, and they all write wine blogs and also have other publications that they contribute to, but they also do a lot of their wine writing through social media, posts on Facebook. Joe does a lot of wine reviews on Twitter, and so there are a lot of different ways that your story and your information can get out there through wine bloggers. So just wanted to have you each talk a little bit about how you use social media in your wine writing.
Well, I resisted Facebook and Twitter for a long time, conceiving of them as trivial for twits. And then someone said to me 3 years ago, I suppose, that Facebook and Twitter are good marketing tools for your blog. You should use them in that way. So reluctantly, I opened a Twitter account and I opened a Facebook page. And of course, Facebook absolutely sucks your soul dry. Every time I post to my blog, I link that post on Facebook and Twitter. And within a year, traffic to the blog doubled. Last year, I had 1.1 million visits to the blog, which is something I would never have conceived of, and probably never would have accomplished if I did not have the Facebook and the Twitter presence. It's very, very important. And if you follow California wine and you see that there are some wineries who are very active in terms of social media and even have their own social media departments now. Now these are big wineries, of course. We're not talking about small sort of family-owned wineries because you do have to have the resources. But I think it is increasingly important to have that sort of presence on the internet.
I kind of live on Twitter. That's my home base. And similarly, I would probably say I can certainly attribute a large portion of the growth of my brand within wine and the influence of it to Twitter. So I owe Twitter a lot, actually. And luckily for me, all these channels, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, whatever, they all require a slightly different approach, and some people naturally fall into one or the other, and Twitter for me, it was just perfect. And what's amazing about it is you can cite so many examples where the playing field was leveled by these tools. So for David and Goliath, all of a sudden they're the same size on here. Certainly there's no way I would be as influential as I am in the space without that. And it's largely, I think, responsible for my brand literally going from nowhere. I mean, I came out of nowhere as a passionate consumer in wine. I mean, how is that possible? I mean, it's possible because these tools level the playing field. And something that I encourage wineries and PR people to think about is that, I mean, I have examples where I've asked people in situations like this, where I'm on a panel or giving a talk, and ask people in the audience questions. And I asked a person a question about a bad situation, kind of a bad situation they had in a tasting room. Okay, they were talking about that during this discussion, and I asked her, well, let's say I said something about that winery, and I don't know, Wine Enthusiast or any magazines were online saying something about that winery, and then that winery said something to you on Twitter or Facebook about the same situation. Like, who would you most believe in that scenario? Would it be somebody like me, or somebody from traditional media, somebody from the winery? And this person basically said, I'd do that all equally, especially since they're all interacting with me. And that is amazingly powerful. I mean, we've never had that kind of situation before in any kind of media. So talk about leveling the playing field, right? There's a couple, I think, strong examples of why it's important to be on that space, and not just there saying, hey, look what I did, or I have a new wine, or whatever, here's an event. Actually talking to people, because really what these platforms are, it's just a water cooler. I mean, it's just, everybody wants to connect about things that they like, and that's just what these platforms do. So the power is in connecting like a real, normal human, right? Like we do when we talk to one another. And fortunately, everybody here is a real, normal human, right? So we can all treat each other online the same way.
I'm not just a wine writer, I'm also a wine consumer. I'm fairly certain that in 2013 I spent more money on wine than food. So I can speak about the impact of social media on wine buying habits, even if I take off my wine writing hat. So personally, I use Instagram. I don't use Delectable because I don't have an iPhone, but hopefully you've all at least heard of Delectable. I use Instagram basically to track the wines I consume. So fortunately or unfortunately, if you follow me on Instagram, you'll see how many wines I taste each day or each week. My mom thinks I'm a raging alcoholic as a result of my Instagram feed. But there are certain people who I follow on Twitter and Instagram, and if I can tell that they are genuinely excited about a wine, I will immediately purchase that wine sight unseen, simply because someone I know, sometimes people I haven't even met in real life, are excited about it. And they might be people like me who are tweeting, say, or taking photos of 20 bottles of wine each week. But if there's something in that tweet or Instagram post to tip me off that this was a truly exciting wine, maybe it's Finger Lakes Riesling that I've never heard of. Maybe it's a brand new grower champagne that just got into Chamber Street Wine. Maybe it's something from, I don't know, maybe it's a new producer in Maryland that I have never explored before. If somebody who I trust as a thought leader, a phrase I hate, but let's say I trust them as a thought leader, if they are truly excited about wine, and I can tell that, there's a good chance I'm going to go and purchase that wine. And I can't be the only one in the world doing that. So, there have been weekends when I've gone to Virginia wineries because of a post that a Virginia winery has put out on Facebook just to their regular consumers. Not like a PR pitch, hey David, we'd love you to join us for this oyster festival. It's because I've liked this winery on Facebook, and then when my newsfeed says, hey, this weekend we're doing this event for $40 and I have no plans, there's a good chance I can go down there. So, from kind of both angles, as producing content, every winery needs to be using all these things, and also you should look to wine bloggers, somms, thought leaders in the wine space to pitch, even if all you're hoping for is that they Instagram your bottle.
I only use Twitter, actually, to relate to the wine bar. I mean, I'm not on there constantly like this guy is. But I mean, that's just, other than that, I don't live on Twitter.
Well, I think we should probably open it up to questions if any of you has a question you'd like to ask.
Mark, there's been some attrition in the wine blogger sphere. How are you guys staying
perhaps your key phrase is making it work for ourselves. I think all three of us have a very individual sort of approach to thinking about wine, writing about wine, putting it out there on the internet, on our blogs and various other vehicles. And I think that's the way that you have to survive as a wine blogger, and that is through your integrity, authenticity, and a highly individual approach.
So the question was right, about attrition and blogs and how are we still here? Is that basically it? And how do we, oh I see, so why do we not give up? Right, is that part of it?
Yeah, because some people have.
Yeah, some people, yeah, there's attrition in blogging about passionate topics in every niche. There always is. So that's natural. Some of us are just so geeky into the concept and the topic that we don't want to give it up. I certainly fall into that. I think for me, in particular, I'm lucky. I started early. I was relatively early in the wine blogging scene. That affords me a decent-sized audience with a lot of freedom. So I'm very lucky in that I can talk about whatever I want. I don't have to specialize in order to stand out, which I think is largely what you have to do now in niche topics, because just naturally over time, there's just land available to grab, right? There's only so many of those passionate consumers in that audience, and eventually the space kind of gets taken up. And speaking for the U.S. market, obviously, there's huge land grab opportunities in Asia right now for that, huge. So anyway, for me, I was lucky I got in there early, and so I think that fortunately for me, because the passion is still there, and because I have such freedom to talk about literally anything I want from an op-ed perspective in wine, or order any wines from any region that I want to cover, that keeps that fire alive. I mean, I still love it, and I think that comes off, and hopefully people feed off of that when they read it.
Just very quickly, there's been a ton of attrition in wine blogging. I think probably, I launched my site in 2010, which was relatively late to the game. But since then, I've never missed a business day. I've blogged every single day for 4 years now. I think the main reason there's been so much attrition is because it's very hard to do anything for free. And even the most successful blogs in the world, the most successful wine blogs in the world, hardly generate any revenue at all on the blog itself. So if you are a passionate wine geek who wants to launch a wine blog, how long will you keep producing original content that you are doing for free? That's a question that I have to ask myself, Joe has to ask himself, Adriano has to ask himself, Frederick has to ask themselves. However, I'm a big believer that the cream rises to the top, and that the wine bloggers who are capable of parlaying their blogging career into other opportunities can figure out a way to make it work. If it weren't for my wine blog, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I wouldn't be writing for Grid Collective. I wouldn't have plenty of other speaking and educational opportunities out there. So I think there's ways to make it work, and I think there's plenty of room out there, whether there's no specialist in Michigan Riesling right now that everyone points to. There's also no specialist in Cru Beaujolais. But I think a generalist could still launch a successful site today if he or her was a good writer and were dedicated to the craft.
And if I could just, there's always another bottle of wine. You open a box and, you try this wine and you just say, oh my God, I have got to write about this wine because it is so great, and I want my readers to know about it, and so every time the FedEx guy or the UPS guy comes into the door and says, hey, I got more booze for you, we know each other, we're all, first name basis, and there's that possibility that sample you open is going to be something so compelling that, it just keeps you going.
Yes?
What are some elements of a some really unusual winery stories that would reflect sort of the diversity of interesting stories about wines and wineries.
I love to get these messages from wineries, and somebody says, "You probably never heard of us, and it's me and my family, and my sister drives a tractor, and my mother keeps the books, and we make about 1,000 cases of wine a year in a good year, and we just wonder, would you taste our wines?" And that's very exciting, because it means there's a personal story there. There's a story, not that I have to go to, someplace and do that, but we communicate and we talk, and I get the information and taste the wines, and I think, like any of us would say, there are no guarantees. You can send me your wine, but that doesn't mean you're going to get some great review or anything. And they always say, well, we understand that. But the idea of being able to do that sort of personal story about a family that is really sort of sacrificing in order to create this kind of vision that they have for making this small little amount of wine. I think that's terrific, and that doesn't mean that I don't write about or review wines from corporations and huge importers and everything, and those wines may be fantastic, but the personal story, the history, is not as interesting. And that's really, I think, what readers, not just myself as the writer, but I think that's what readers really want to see.
To that point, for me, it comes down to the readers, and I get pitches all the time. I think this would be great to share with your readers, and I'm like, I think it'd be great if you mowed my lawn, and paid me $1. That kind of pitch is trying to exploit all the hard work you've done building up your audience, right? But the things that work is what works for them, and what works for them right now essentially is good juice. That's the first thing, and then the second thing is probably struggle. Some kind of struggle. Something that ties that juice to humanity. It could be that it's just so gloriously good, and that's the story. That's happened, but it's that's obviously rare. A lot of it, I think, comes down to what aspect of that wine, its production and the people, like what did that tell us about just a tiny bit about the human condition? Because that's what we want, right? Writers want that, people want that. That's what you want. Why are the Netflix and Hulu series and all that stuff that we binge watch now? Why is that so popular? It's because there's struggle. It's well executed, and it's pulling something out about the human condition that we can all identify with. Sounds like a tall order, but those things actually come in surprising ways.
I'll be quick because I know we're running short on time. Every single winery has an infinite number of good stories to tell. Most, however, are very bad at telling those stories. And I say that, I'm thinking of at least 2 successful pitches right now. Napa Cabernet is not an interesting story. Everybody knows that Napa makes Cab. A couple of years ago, though, I was invited by the Stags Leap Wine District Brothers, whatever the trade group is called, to come work harvest for 2 weeks. I went out there for about 8 days and worked harvest, and I was very, very explicit in all of my emails that I had no interest in sitting in a sunny vineyard drinking Sauvignon Blanc. I wanted to shovel out tanks. I wanted to see what was actually done, because that was their pitch to me, that wine writers write about wine, but nobody knows, and we like to think of it as this beautiful agricultural product, which it is, but no one sees the manufacturing side of it and how this is really hard manual labor. I thought this sounded like a lot of fun, and it was all right. Napa Cab is not an interesting story, but immersing myself in the work of an actual, cellar rat for 2 weeks, this can make for a lot of stories, and it did. Another good story, another good pitch I got not too long ago was a PR person in Oregon reached out to me and said, "Hey, no one knows about Oregon Riesling. Everyone in this room, if I said Oregon, what do you think of? You're all going to say Pinot Noir, like Pavlovian dogs. Everyone thinks of Oregon with Pinot Noir. No one has even heard of Oregon Riesling." That made for a really interesting story. There's an infinite number of good stories, and it's just kind of figuring out what that is.
Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Just a quick commentary on your opinion on what you think a blog can do for any particular winery. So we're considering that in our marketing department, just, breaking out with a weekly blog or something like that.
Do you mean
Just
as far
about
as
our own-
doing your own blog?
Correct. Not about the wine in general, in the wine world in general, but about us. And to get that out to our local
Okay.
and interested
Yeah,
consumers.
and
Any thoughts
any
on that?
advice?
I think the wineries have successful blogs, Jordan, for example, in California. They deal with the daily routine and the daily events of the winery. And I mean, it's very well done, and the videography and the commentary and everything. But if you focus on that aspect and on the aspect of the people involved in the winery, who during harvest, who's picking the grapes, who's actually running the equipment, who's out there pruning in pruning season, who's in the tasting room selling the wine. If you keep it on a really personal basis that deals with the everyday history of the winery, I think that's what people are looking for.
Agree 1,000%. But I will only add that you want to. It's an avenue for you to tell your own stories, and the more personal and crazy and weird and interesting and fun that they can be, then that's what you want. It needs to be sort of the antithesis of the press release. I think Ridge has a great one. Talbot's Creek has another great one. And to Frederick's point, they're focusing on just the random things that come up, and a lot of times opinion. And that's why people come to sites, I think, like ours, in a lot of ways because they want our opinions on things. I think that's part of what makes it popular. You're not going to most blogs to get content that you otherwise read on AP. You know what I mean? You don't want objective reporting after which you're going to make your own decision about the situation, right? Like, we're not talking about breaking big news stories. What you want, you're going there specifically because you want something with that kind of personality, or that kind of writing, that kind of edginess or approach. So that's really, there's no difference in that approach for what we do, I would think, than what a winery should do for their blog.
I feel a little bad mentioning Jordan, Talbot's Creek, and Ridge, but I do think they're going to something. And I think a big part of the reason for it is that they don't see their blogs as entirely promotional vehicles for themselves. Even if you were a small local winery, your blog needs to be about engagement with your audience and trying to forever grow your audience. And if all you're writing about is the latest sale you're offering, or we're waiving the tasting fee this weekend, or we're throwing this party next weekend, you might get Facebook likes, you might get shares because people like free stuff, but you're not going to have an engaged set of readers. You're not going to have ambassadors and evangelists for your brand. And I think the way to create ambassadors and evangelists for your brand in social media is to create content that they care about reading. It might not need to be a blog. It might just be Facebook posts. Show that you have opinions. Show that you care about the community. When you do a corporate retreat to the local soup kitchen, take photos of it. When you donate wine to a Heart Association event, write about why you chose to donate to the Heart Association. Things along those lines.
What is your winery?
We own La Belle Winery in Amherst, New Hampshire. Nobody talks about
Oh
New
my
Hampshire
God,
wine.
New Hampshire.
We'd love to send you some New Hampshire wine.
Well, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you to our panelists for coming down to talk to you guys today. And by the way, in the speaker bios in your programs, it has all of their Twitter handles and their blog addresses. So you should definitely follow them and check them out. Thank you.